Welcome back to Let Us Reason Together, where we open the Word of God, we walk through it line by line from a Reformed perspective. I'm your host, Tim Adams. I'm the pastor of Sovereign Grace Community Church here in Craig, Colorado. And if you've been with us for the first two episodes of this series in Romans, you've already seen the glorious beginning of Paul's declaration that he is not ashamed of the gospel because it is the power of God for salvation to everyone who believes. But now, in Romans chapter 1, beginning in verse 18 through 23, we're going to see a definite shift in the tone. Paul begins to lay the foundation for the gospel by showing us why the gospel is necessary. The righteousness of God has been revealed, yes, but now we learn that the wrath of God is also being revealed. And unless we understand God's holy wrath, we cannot rightly grasp his redeeming grace. So let's read the passage together. And again, I'm reading from the Legacy Standard Bible. And it says, "For the wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all ungodliness and unrighteousness of men who suppress the truth in unrighteousness. Because that which is known about God is evident within them, for God made it evident to them. For since the creation of the world, his invisible attributes, both his eternal power and divine nature, have been clearly seen, being understood through what has been made, so that they are without excuse. For even though they knew God, they did not glorify him as God or give thanks, but they became futile in their thoughts, and their foolish heart was darkened. Professing to be wise, they became fools and exchanged the glory of the incorruptible God for an image in the likeness of corruptible man and of birds and four-footed animals and crawling creatures." This section begins with Paul's diagnosis of humanity's condition before God. And he doesn't start with ignorance. He starts with rejection. See, the problem isn't that people don't know enough about God. The problem is that they suppress the truth that they do know. In Reformed theology, we speak of this as total depravity. Not that people are as bad as they could be, but that every part of human nature has been corrupted by sin. And so what Paul outlines here is it's not a problem with the mind, it's not a mistake of the mind, but it is a rebellion of the will. So let's go through this verse by verse, beginning with verse 18, which starts, "The wrath of God is revealed from heaven." This is the first mention of wrath in Romans, and it is very important. It's very crucial. God is not indifferent to sin. He is not passive. His wrath is holy, righteous, and measured. It's not like the anger that you and I have. It's not impulsive. It's not self-centered. It is his settled opposition to all that is evil. And Paul said that this wrath is, what does he say there? It revealed from heaven. Now that word revealed is in the present tense in the Greek. In other words, this isn't only about future judgment, though that is coming, but God's wrath is already active in the world. It is present right now. And against whom? Well, verse 18 continues, "All ungodliness and unrighteousness of man." This is both the vertical ungodliness and the horizontal unrighteousness. It is rebellion against God and injustice toward man. And what do people do? Well, he continues, they suppress the truth in unrighteousness. Not ignore it, but suppress it. It's an act of the will. Fallen humanity tramps down the truth, pushes down the truth, like trying to hold a beach ball underwater. It's visible, but we want it gone. Now, so this shows that man's problem, it's not intellectual, but moral. He doesn't lack light. Man doesn't lack light. He rejects it. Now let's move on to verse 19, the next verse. "That which is known about God is evident within them." Now, Paul now explains why people are accountable. That which is known about God is evident within them. This refers to what theologians call general revelation. God has made basic truths about himself internally evident through conscience, moral awareness, and reason. And every person has this. God made it evident to them. In other words, God has revealed himself clearly enough that everyone is accountable. This ties into what we call natural theology, the truth about God that can be known through creation and reason. But this knowledge it doesn't save you. It's what we call, it's not salvific. It only condemns, it does not save. Now let's move on to verse 20. And verse 20 says this, for since the creation of the world. Now Paul expands, his invisible attributes have been clearly seen. That's a paradox, right? Invisible things clearly seen. But Paul is saying that God's eternal power and divine nature are on display in creation. We see it in the order of the cosmos. We see it in the beauty of nature. Last night, my wife and I went out we have a reservoir here near Craig called Elkhead Reservoir. We took our kayaks out there as the sun was setting and had just a beautiful, wonderful time and enjoyed the creation that God has created. And so we see that in the beauty of nature. We see it in the existence of moral law, right and wrong, that pretty much every single person in the world seems to have at least a basic understanding. And all of that proclaims a powerful and intelligent creator. And the result, so that, look at what Paul says here in verse 20, so that they are without excuse. No one can stand before God and claim ignorance. The evidence is overwhelming, but the heart is hardened. People are not atheists by nature. This is why I have no idea how many religions there are in the world, but there are a lot. This is why people are inveterate worshipers, because we are not atheists by nature. People become atheists by suppressing what they know to be true. Now that brings us to verse 21. And verse 21 says, for even though they knew God, this is the tragedy. This is the heartbreak. They knew God, not in a saving way, but in a general awareness way. They know there is a creator. They know there is a moral order. They know there is a lawgiver. But what do? He continues, they did not glorify him as God, even though they know about him, even though they know him. Or it says, give thanks. This is the essence of sin. Refusing to give God the glory and gratitude that he deserves. And the result, look at what he says there. They became futile in their thoughts. That word futile means empty, purposeless. The human mind becomes darkened when it turns away from the source of all truth. This is called the noetic effects of sin. Sin darkens the mind. Fallen man does not think rightly about God, about the world, or about himself. Now that brings us then to verse 22, where it says, professing to be wise, they became fools. Now this verse reads like a commentary on our modern age, doesn't it? Humanity proclaims its brilliance. We see this all the time. Science, technology, philosophy. There's, amazing things that man does. Sending men to the moon. What we're experiencing right now, the technology that allows me to broadcast this to you through a podcast format. The fact that I can record this on a phone that I can hold in my hand, that is the brilliance, the science, the technology, the philosophy of man professing to be wise. In other words, hey, we know all this stuff. We're smarter than God. You're ignorant if you believe in God. But in rejecting God, man becomes morally and spiritually bankrupt. And we see that in our culture today. There is so much moral degeneracy, moral bankruptcy, and then that leads to a spiritually bankrupt culture. And we're always struck by this. I'm always struck by this every Sunday morning. Before we go to church, we always run by, we have our supermarket out here is called City Market. It's owned by Kroger. We used to live in Kansas, so it's very similar to Dillon's. And we run to City Market every Sunday morning. This is my little dog Snickers coming in here. He's the one that you hear barking in the background. He's probably trying to get my attention. But when we go to the store, I'm always struck by how many people are in there, and it doesn't even occur to them to go to church. I've noticed that a lot of times you see a lot of the same people in there on Sunday morning. A lot of them are doing probably their grocery shopping for the week. That's their routine on Sunday. Their routine is not to worship God. That is the result of moral and spiritual bankruptcy. The idea that it doesn't even cross your mind that maybe you should go worship God. Now, Paul is using irony here. In Greek, the word for fool is the word moreno, from which we get the English word moron. They think they are brilliant, but their wisdom is folly before God. And we see this all the time in our culture. People will kind of get out ahead of their skis morally, and then something will happen in their life as a result of their immoral decisions, and then they act so surprised. And I see this all the time I teach school during the school year, and I see this with so many of the families that I deal with that are broken. Well, they're broken because of immoral behavior, and then there's this shock and this idea that, we need to help these families, and we do, but the greatest help that they need is the gospel. There's this idea in our culture today, I can kind of do whatever I want, and then there's this shock when there are moral consequences to these things and to those decisions. And that's what Paul is saying here. He's saying, look, they think they're brilliant. They think they're professing to be wise, but in reality, they're fools because they are living outside of God's moral precepts, and there is a result of that. And so, without the fear of the Lord, there is no true wisdom. And that is a harsh reality in our culture today. And we see this over and over again. Now let's move on to verse 23. I want to move on. He says, so they exchanged the glory of the incorruptible God. Think about that. We are designed to worship. In Ecclesiastes, it talks about we are made in the image of God. And because we're made in the image of God, we are made to worship. That's why there's so many religions in the world. We are always looking to worship something. But look at what he says here. They exchanged the glory of the incorruptible God. Now comes the great exchange. Now, this is not the gospel one yet. We're going to see that in chapter 3, but this one is tragic. They exchanged the glory of the incorruptible God for what? For images. Man, as I've said, was made to worship. You are made to worship. I am made to worship. Everybody worships something. If we don't worship God, we're going to worship something else. And it will always be something less than God. And Paul here lists in verse 23, he says, exchange the glory of the incorruptible God for an image in the likeness of corruptible man and of birds and four-footed animals and crawling creatures. So he lists them here. Images of man, the likeness of corruptible man, that's self-worship, which I really believe, especially here in the United States, I think that's our biggest idol, is the idol of self. Birds, they worship things in the sky, four-footed animals, they worship the land, crawling creatures, the ground. Now, this is all a direct reference to idolatry, and it mirrors the downward spiral of sin. The worship that we should have that should go upward to God has gone downward all the way to the ground. So you're worshiping self, you're worshiping the sky, birds, you're worshiping four-footed animals, the land, you're worshiping crawling creatures that are on the ground. So you go from upward all the way downward. So it's a downward spiral of sin and self-worship. So idolatry isn't just about statues. And I think a lot of times that's what we think of when we think of idol worship. And there's parts of the world that you go to where there is definitely idolatry, and you see that. But I think especially here in the United States, I think the biggest thing that we worship is the worship of self. But idolatry isn't just about little statues or images or things like that. It is about substituting anything for God. That can be success, that can be money, sex, politics, entertainment, even self. So why does this matter? Well, Romans chapter 1, verses 18 through 23 really is a mirror. It shows us who we are apart from the grace of God. We are creatures with a knowledge of God. Everyone knows about God. It is readily apparent. It is evident to everyone. We are suppressors of the truth. Everyone knows the truth of God, but they suppress it. Again, that image of the beach ball that you're trying to hold under the water. We are ingrates who fail to worship. We are thinkers whose minds have gone dark. And we are worshipers of created things instead of the Creator. Now, this is the beginning of Paul's indictment on the human race. And it sets up our desperate need for the gospel. And brothers and sisters and friends, that's because without understanding the wrath of God, we will never treasure the grace of God. I'm going to say that again. Without understanding the wrath of God, you can never understand, you can never treasure the grace of God. And here's the hope. Paul isn't done. Romans would be a really depressing book if it ended after about the middle of Romans chapter 3. But Paul's not done yet. This is the diagnosis. And in order to be treated, if I have a health issue, I've got to go to the doctor. The doctor's got to diagnose it, and then they know how to treat it. And that's what this part of Romans is. It is the diagnosis. It's also been called the indictment of the human condition. The cure is coming, and we're going to see that, and it's glorious. But until we feel the weight of our sin, we won't rejoice in the gift of salvation. This is why so much of what is classified as the gospel today in evangelical circles is not, because sin is never confronted. It's always presented as, God's going to make your life better. Well, he is, but here's why your life is a mess. And your life is a mess because of the sin in your life, because you're like the Romans 1 man. You know the truth, but you suppress the truth in unrighteousness. Well, I want to thank you for joining me this morning for this heavy but necessary episode of Let Us Reason Together. And in our next episode, we'll continue in Romans 1, and we'll explore how this rejection of God leads to increasing corruption, not just of the mind, but of the body, of morality, and of society ourselves. And we are definitely seeing that in our culture. So I just ask if this podcast has helped you better understand the Word of God, which I hope it has. I hope that you'll consider sharing it with those that are in your circle of influence. And remember to subscribe so you won't miss the rest of this powerful series here as we work our way through Romans. Well, until next time, let us glorify God, give him thanks, and live by faith. And as it is Friday, I just want to remind you to, if you don't have a church, to find a church that preaches the Word of God verse by verse, chapter by chapter, and book by book. And as I often say, it's probably not going to be the biggest church in your community, but it is certainly probably the most faithful. If you're here in the Yampa Valley, we want to invite you to join us at Sovereign Grace Community Church and we meet at 10 a.m. on Sunday mornings in the ballroom at the Quality Inn here in Craig, Colorado. So until next time, Sole Deo Gloria. Thank you.